me, I'm Bryan King. Like I said, my family history goes back several generations here. I'm a poultry cattle farmer, so that's an ideal small business. So I do understand small business, and what this district encompasses is a lot of small business. My opponent's right. So I've spent 6 years in the legislature, but my time as a farmer in the last 20 years has taught me one thing about budgets and money. You just don't count dollars, you have to count cents. And I've done that in the legislature, because I was taught that by my family, my dad. And I want to say this about my dad. As many of you know, that some of you know, he recently had surgery and had his knees replaced, and he had never had surgery in his life. He was worried about going in the operating room, and he tells me, he said, well, the biggest thing I don't like about this whole thing is putting on this insurance gown. And I'm like, what do you mean insurance gown? It's a hospital gown. I said, why are you calling it insurance gown? He said, well, I call it that because you think you're covered, but you're not. And I have to have the disclaimer to the good insurance companies. But I want to say about being covered, and I think as your state representative up here, that I've worked very hard to cover this area. We talked about schools and rural schools and the issues. I want to tell you my record. First off, we talk about variable schools here. If you remember when they passed the millage increase a few years ago, they went to the state, they had their plans approved before the millage. They go down there, and the bureaucrats down there in the Department of Education reneged on it. They sit there and said, no, we're not going to pay you what we said we were going to pay you. And you know what? I went to bat for them. It took me 2 years, but you can research back in the newspapers and ask Doug Harris. You know what? We got them back, I got them back the $1 million they were promised. Now, I didn't do that because it's my district, and that's the political thing to do. I did it because the promise made should be a promise kept. And a lot of times we talked about the Department of Education, and the federal government is continually putting more constraints on our education department, which filters down to our local level. And you know what? I've been fighting that. If you look at Obamacare and implemented in Arkansas, I have a clear record of voting against that, speaking out against that. But I also been, instead of being opposed, I've also been a reformer. Representative Dan Greenberg and I started talking about Medicaid reforms back in 2009. In fact, I introduced a bill about health savings accounts to try and help people achieve health insurance the right way. Not the President Obama forced it on people way, the right way. So you go back and look at my record on that. We talked about Medicaid reform because in states like Florida had pilot programs that essentially put the patient-centered care in Medicaid. And what they found in that Medicaid program was that Medicaid costs stayed flat. But they continually ignored that down in Little Rock, and the democratically controlled, and a lot of Republicans too, I'll be honest, would not force a lot of the reforms that would have took place to help alleviate this $350 million shortfall. And I've been working on that because you could see what happened. In 2009, our economy was going up. We had a $1 billion surplus when I went in. We had a $300 million surplus in 2009. You know what happened? The economy, we kept saying the government was growing too much. And you know what happened? In revenue stabilization, our budget bill, they do the spending for it. And we have to have a proposed balanced budget. But what also that does is set the spending limit for Arkansas. Kept seeing it increase. I was saying, you know what? Folks in the real world are hurting right now. Because you go out and listen to small businesses and the farmers, their incomes were going down. Kept saying in state government, we were growing state government jobs too much. I was a leader and first one to start doing that. And now we have a lot of Republicans following along and saying we need to cut spending. A lot of people talk about being competitive in other states. Well, the reality is, to be able to do that, you can talk about it and do the incentives, but the reality is you have to look at state government spending and be able to address that in specific ways and be smart enough when you go to a state agency and say, you need to cut back. I'll give you a specific example. In the forestry department was consolidated with the Department of Agriculture. It was supposed to save administration costs. You know what? Never saved $1 in administration costs. They consolidated and didn't do it. When the forestry head resigned here recently, $100,000 a year job, you had salaries and benefits, you're talking about $130,000. You can employ 4 people out in the field in the forestry department. And I said they didn't need to fill it. You know what? They went ahead and filled it anyway. That's what, when we get people, business people, conservatives down there in control, we're going to be able to change the face of government in health care. We're also going to be able to do it in addressing the federal government. Let me tell you about another thing. The Second Amendment is very important. It's very important all in this district. Recently I got an A rating by a gun rights group. And so, I've worked very hard to make sure we fight the federal government because you know what? Our rights are being taken away, and we don't need to be compromised by average rating. So I've worked very hard on these issues, and the one thing I want to close with is the photo ID requirement bill. In a lot of legislatures that's being passed where you have to have a photo ID to be able to vote. In other legislature, it's following along party lines. Well, I was able to pass that bill out of the House of Representatives, what they call the most partisan committee. I was able to pass it on the House floor with Democrat votes. Now, it went to the Senate and died. And those things are very important to me in its election reform, and I want to work very hard. Last issue on school issues, the Eureka Springs school issue, the state, once again, is coming in trying to have the money that they shouldn't have. Those people should be able to keep their money that they have. And they have the law on their side, and you continually have them fight that in court. They've won a court battle. I've been in the legislature fighting it. Regardless of how the court rules on that issue alone, you know, the legislature, you're going to have to either play offense or defense. And I think I've worked very hard to be able to get the support, to be able to work hard and get things done in the district. I've learned the values of having to count dollars and cents, as I mentioned others, as a farmer. So anyway, I've worked very hard and I appreciate your support.
Thank you.